Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Why the Right Went Wrong. Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond by E.J. Dionne Jr. Narrated by Mike Chamberlain. Introduction. What happened to conservatism? Why reforming the country requires transforming the right. The history of contemporary American conservatism is a story of disappointment and betrayal. For a half-century, conservative politicians have made promises to their supporters that they could not keep. They offered stirring oratory that was not commensurate to what was possible. They described a small government utopia that was impractical and politically unsustainable because it required wrenching changes to government that most Americans didn't want. They denounced decades of change, pledging what amounted to a return to the government and the economy of the 1890s, the cultural norms of the 1950s, and, in more recent times, the ethnic makeup of the country in the 1940s. This proved to be far beyond the capacity of politics. Most Americans, including a great many who were neither very liberal nor radical, and especially the young, did not want to go back. Conservatives have won many elections since their movement began to take control of the Republican Party more than a half-century ago. But these victories produced neither the lasting electoral realignment that conservative prophets kept predicting, nor the broad policy changes the faithful hoped for. For the rank-and-file right, the sense that their leaders had failed them and the political system had shortchanged them created a cycle of radicalization. We are living with its fruits today. The Trumpification of Republican politics during the summer of 2015 provided gaudy confirmation that something is amiss. It's true that Donald Trump's unlikely insurgency reflected the complete fusion of the culture of celebrity with politics that the billionaire builder, television star, birther, and self-promoter perfected. His rise could certainly be seen as part of a distemper that bred a mood of anti-establishment protest across the world's democracies. But the deeper ideological force behind Trumpism is rooted in history. It was compactly summarized by Eric Erickson, editor of the popular right-wing blog Red State. The Republican Party created Donald Trump, he said, because they made a lot of promises to their base and never kept them. It is a problem that goes a long way back. Since 1968, no conservative administration, not Richard Nixon's, not Ronald Reagan's, and neither of the Bush presidencies, could live up to the rhetoric conservative politicians deployed to rally their supporters. Their appeals were rooted in the aspirations of the Goldwater movement that began reshaping American politics 50 years ago. The hopes Goldwater inspired were regularly frustrated. In response, movement conservatives advanced an even purer ideology, certain that doing so would eventually bring them the triumphs that had eluded them over and over. Consider the steady march rightward. The collapse of the Nixon presidency led to the rise of Ronald Reagan. The defeat of George H.W. Bush led to Newt Gingrich's revolution. The re-election of Bill Clinton pushed Republicans to impeach him. The partial exception to this pattern is George W. Bush. Yet by the time his second term was over, the cycle reasserted itself as his failures led to the rise of the Tea Party. The second President Bush initially undertook a partial modernization of the right, preaching compassionate conservatism and seeking, in effect, a fourth way in response to Clinton's third way between left and right. But Bush's modernization project was incomplete, in many ways superficial, and short-lived. After carefully examining the reasons behind Bush's loss of the popular vote in 2000, Karl Rove, the architect of Bush's victories, concluded that moderation was a less effective political tactic than rallying the conservative faithful, and two wars eventually engulfed the administration, creating new sources of radicalism around national security questions, and, for some on the right, attitudes toward Muslims. Bush's difficulties, of course, might have led to a search for a more moderate conservatism. Instead, conservatives quickly defined Bush as an advocate of big government whose failures owed to his refusal to be conservative enough on spending, immigration, education, and Medicare. A return to the true faith was the only prescription on order. The result was the Tea Party, which was as much a reaction to Bush as to the election of Barack Obama. The long journey to the right continued. This process has been self-reinforcing. The rise of cultural and religious conservatism, along with the emergence of the white South as the central pillar of the Republican Party, called forth a counter-realignment. As middle-of-the-road and progressive Republicans outside the South fled the party, it lost voters and leaders who would have supported moderate or moderately conservative candidates in primaries. The numbers tell the story. Between January 1995 and January 2015, the proportion of Republicans who called themselves very conservative nearly doubled, from 19% to 33%. When even Eric Cantor, the very conservative former House Majority Leader, could be felled in a primary for being insufficiently faithful to the ideas of the right, no Republican could feel truly safe from challenge. This is why the most important political development during Barack Obama's years in office was not the rise of a new progressive governing coalition that so many on the center-left anticipated when he swept the country in 2008. That coalition may yet become dominant. Demography is on its side, and it has proven its power in 2 consecutive presidential elections. But Obama's tenure also coincided with the climax of a half-century of political agitation that transformed the Republican Party and American conservatism. The breakdown in American government and the dysfunction in our politics are the result of the steady radicalization of American conservatism, along with Obama's failure to anticipate it and his tardiness in dealing with it. Obama's dreams of overcoming the divisions of red and blue America and of putting unity of purpose over conflict and discord were stillborn. Obama eventually came to terms with the nature of the opposition he faced and acted accordingly. The substantial achievements of his final years in office were usually brought about unilaterally, without the support of Republicans, and most often in the face of their strenuous resistance. This was true of his steps toward immigration reform, his measures against climate change, the normalization of relations with Cuba, the nuclear deal he negotiated with Iran, and a host of other measures. There are many accounts of Obama's presidency that lay the blame for his difficulties on personal failures, on his well-known reluctance to court and curry favor with Congress, his standoffishness, his reliance on a tight circle of personal aides, his tactical mistakes. Obama certainly had his shortcomings. But to assume that Obama was ever in a position to build broad support among Republicans for his program ignores their determination, from the very first day of his presidency, to prevent progressive policies from taking hold. More effective schmoozing and more invitations to the White House might have been nice, but they would not have solved Obama's problem. The fierceness of the opposition he faced had deep structural and historical roots in the long-term changes in conservatism and in the Republican Party. This book offers a historical view of the American right since the 1960s. Its core contention is that American conservatism and the Republican Party did not suddenly become fiercer and more unyielding simply because of the election of Obama. The condition of today's conservatism is the product of a long march that began with a wrong turn, when first American conservatives and then the Republican Party itself adopted Barry Goldwater's worldview during and after the 1964 campaign. Goldwater was personally appealing, principled, and candid. In the final years of his life, he became more moderate himself, uneasy with the direction in which many of his followers took the movement he did so much to build. Nonetheless, the radicalism of conservatism in our day is not primarily the product of the Tea Party. Rather, the Tea Partiers are the logical consequence of the ideology Goldwater preached. Goldwaterism, in turn, was rooted in the reaction of large sections of American conservatism to the New Deal in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and of a revolt against the efforts of more moderate conservatives to come to terms with the America FDR and his successors had created. The Tea Party was simply preaching the Goldwater creed in all its purity. It is a mark of the success of the Goldwater movement that in the ensuing decades, it did more than simply drive liberals and then moderates out of the Republican Party. It also beat back alternative definitions of conservatism that were more temperate, more inclined to shape rather than resist cultural change, and more open to a significant role by government in solving problems. One of the central purposes of this book is to argue that there was a road not taken by American conservatism. It was a path laid out by Dwight Eisenhower and the like-minded Republicans of his time. The moderation that characterized their approach is precisely the quality that American conservatism is now missing and badly needs. It is a disposition that the historian Clinton Rossiter described simply but insightfully, writing when the right was at its turning point in the 1950s and 1960s. Conservatives, he said, have the obligation to steer a prudent course between too much progress, which throws us into turmoil, and too little, which is an impossible state for Americans to endure. Rossiter viewed conservatism's highest mission as fostering the spirit of unity among all classes and callings in the name of preserving a successful way of life. That Eisenhower and the modern republicanism he preached are now regarded as moderate or even liberal is a sign of how far to the right American conservatism has moved. Joe Scarborough, the former Gingrich-era congressman and television host, is one of the few contemporary conservatives to grasp that it's a mistake for conservatives to view Eisenhower as a bland moderate, a figure of safety and accommodation, even a Democrat in Republican golf cleats whose conservatism could never equal that of Nixon or Reagan or George W. Bush. On the contrary, Scarborough argues, Eisenhower knew how to win elections and how to govern conservatively. We should learn from his example. This book explores the history of contemporary conservatism to make the case that to move forward, today's conservatives must revisit and reverse the wrong turn their movement took 50 years ago. Understanding the long trajectory of the American right is also essential to understanding the severe constraints faced by those who would reform the conservative movement and revise its ideology. As it has developed in the years since Goldwater, conservatism has come to operate almost exclusively on behalf of older, culturally conservative whites and a new class of wealthy Americans who see any impositions upon them by government as the work of a taker class intent on tearing down capitalism. This worldview is reinforced by an increasingly closed right-wing media system that disciplines those who depart from orthodoxy and screens out dissent, and also by an increasingly powerful donor class that the conservative writer David Frum has called the radical rich. As a result, the Republican Party is no longer the broad coalition of diverse groups that it once was. It has become instead what the political scientists Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein have called the insurgent outlier in American politics. Compromise becomes impossible when it is equated with selling out principle. Tactics such as government shutdowns and threats to the nation's credit in debt-ceiling battles become routine. The opposing party's legislative achievements are neither accepted nor reformed. The contrast between the Republican Party's response to the enactment of Medicare and its reaction to the passage of the Affordable Care Act could hardly be more dramatic. Republicans rapidly came to terms with Medicare, even if they have in recent years tried to pare it back or partially privatize it. Obamacare, on the other hand, has been under constant attack from the right, on the floor of Congress, in the courts, and in many of the states Republicans control. Republicans talked of repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, but all their efforts focused on wiping it off the books. If the United States had a multi-party system, the existence of a strong right-wing party drawing a substantial share of the vote would not be a problem for governing. The system itself would require such a party to reach coalition agreements with more moderate allies to produce a governing agenda. But in a two-party system with separated powers that frequently produces divided government, the radicalization of the right produces a zero-sum game. If it cannot take power, the GOP is committed on principle to preventing its adversaries from governing successfully. The radicalization of conservatism is thus not solely an issue for the Republican Party or for the movement itself. It is a problem for our efforts to reach compromise and common ground. It is a problem for how we govern ourselves. It is a problem for all of us. Reforming American conservatism is one of the most important tasks of our time. It is not surprising that liberals are troubled by conservatism's current form. But radicalization is also creating long-term problems for Republicans themselves, because their party has alienated the young, the country's rising Latino and Asian populations, and African Americans. It is one of history's ironies. The civil rights, cultural, and moral revolutions of the 1960s created the backlash that helped the conservative movement grow between 1964 and 1988, prompting the shift of white Southerners to the GOP, the rise of the Reagan Democrats, and the birth of the religious right. Now conservatives are paying a price for these earlier victories. Over time, what might be termed 60s values, in a more moderate form, have largely won in the broader culture. More openness about sexuality, and particularly the triumph of gay, lesbian, and transgender rights, racial and religious tolerance, environmentalism, gender equality, all have prevailed. They are nearly hegemonic among those under 35 years old. When the Supreme Court declared marriage equality the law of the land in its historic decision of June 26, 2015, there were certainly protests on the right. Yet these seemed surprisingly muted when contrasted with the widespread celebration in the LGBT community and among the young, and also with the quiet acceptance of the decision among so many other Americans. Opposition to same-sex marriage did not disappear, and opponents fought rearguard actions, defending local officials who refused to grant licenses on religious grounds. But the country broadly shared Justice Anthony Kennedy's view that same-sex marriage had come to represent another expression of equal dignity in the eyes of law. Southern states embraced the Confederate flag as a symbol of resistance to civil rights in the 1950s and early 1960s. In the decades that followed, conservative politicians were loath to challenge its prominence as part of Southern state flags or in front of state capitals. These conservative leaders knew well that many on the right, particularly in the South, revered a standard that African Americans saw as a symbol of slavery and racism. Then, in June 2015, 9 African American churchgoers were gunned down in a hideous massacre at a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. The killer was a white racist who had posed proudly in front of the flag of secession. Less than a month later, with the full support of the state's Republican and business establishments, the Confederate banner that had first been raised in 1962 was lowered from its staff and removed from the South Carolina Capitol grounds. It was a symbolic triumph, but a powerful one. It reflected, first, the power of African American Christianity and its witness on behalf of justice. But the lowering of the flag also spoke to the limits of the Southern strategy Republicans had deployed since Goldwater's time to rally whites resistant to the advances of civil rights. It was the act of a nation that wanted to move on and move forward. The gay marriage outcome and the Confederate flag episode demonstrated something else. that generational change could disrupt entrenched attitudes and habits, forcing the hands of even the most cautious politicians. A conservatism defined by the events and the arguments of 50 years ago is losing the battle for the loyalty of the young. The millennials are the only generation in which polls consistently find self-identified liberals matching or outnumbering conservatives, and they are driving a growing social liberalism among all Americans. A Gallup survey in May 2015 found that 31% of Americans described their views on social issues as liberal. It was the first time in Gallup's records that social liberals had achieved equality with social conservatives. As recently as 2009, social conservatives had outnumbered social liberals 42% to 25%. All of this reflects a central fact of American politics. The conservative movement is aging rapidly, a striking change from the relatively recent past. When conservatism was on the rise, it could count on a strong support from young Americans, the Reagan generation as personified by Michael J. Fox's character on Family Ties. No longer. In 1987, the Pew Research Center found that only 39% of conservatives were over 50. In 2014, 53% were. Demography is not always destiny, but over the long run, a party and a movement dominated by older white voters will face a significant handicap as the nation becomes increasingly non-white and as younger and less conservative voters join the electorate in full strength. The dominance on the right of a sharp-edged ideological conservatism is also out of step with a fundamentally moderate country. Moderation has itself been seen as a bad word on the right, since Goldwater demonized it in his 1964 speech to the Republican National Convention. And Republicans called moderates these days are, with a very few exceptions, quite conservative, moderate only in relation to their Tea Party colleagues and in their skepticism of extreme tactics such as government shutdowns. The clash between Tea Party and establishment forces should thus not be mistaken for a fight between conservatism and moderation. It's true that party stalwarts shrewdly managed the 2014 primaries to prevent extreme Tea Party candidates from spoiling the party's chances of retaking the Senate, as far-right nominees had in both 2010 and 2012. But in winning what was sometimes described as a civil war in the party, the establishment paid the price of settling the ideological battle largely in the Tea Party's favor. The conservative writers Rich Lowry and Ramesh Ponnuru christened the Tea Party's ideological triumph with the revealing term establishment tea. The establishment had accommodated the right. It was no longer moderate, and in truth, no longer much of an establishment. As the political scientists Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson wrote after the 2014 elections, based on voting records, the current Republican majority in the Senate is far more conservative than the last Republican majority in the 2000s. They noted the tendency of veteran conservative Republicans to be relabeled as moderate only because of their standing relative to the new hardliners. The long-timers aren't really moving left, they wrote. They're being left behind as their party moves right. But if Republicans and conservatives have moved so far from the political center, why did they do so well in the midterm elections of 2010 and 2014? After 2014, why did Republicans find themselves with more members of the House of Representatives and Democrats with fewer state legislative seats than at any time since 1928? These elections did, indeed, demonstrate the Republican Party's staying power in Congress and in the nation's state houses. The gerrymandering the party was able to execute after its victories in 2010 strengthened its hold on legislative districts at all levels. The Republicans are further advantaged because of the concentration of Democratic voters in urban districts, which Democrats win by landslide majorities. They thereby waste votes the party would prefer to have in more competitive districts. To understand the impact of this combination of gerrymandering and the geographic factors, consider that Barack Obama received some 5 million more votes than Mitt Romney did in 2012, yet carried only 209 House districts. Romney carried 226. But more than maps and residential patterns were at play. Precisely because the Democrats overwhelmingly win the ballots of the young, African Americans, and Latinos, they rely upon an electorate far more likely to turn out in presidential years than in midterm elections. Republicans won in 2010 and 2014 because some 40 million fewer Americans vote in midterms than in presidential elections, and a substantial majority of those 40 million is inclined toward the Democrats. Under a president who insisted that there was only one America, the growing demographic differences between the Republican and Democratic coalitions embedded two Americas into our political system: the America of presidential elections and the America of midterm elections. The 2014 elections confirmed what the 2010 elections had suggested. This electoral pattern will only aggravate the country's difficulties in governing itself. A right-leaning Republican Party is in a strong position to rally a coalition of discontent among older white Americans who dominate the electorate in the off years. But absent a change in its approach, the conservative coalition is threatened with long-term minority status in presidential elections, where a younger, more culturally and ethnically diverse electorate holds sway. And without a major political realignment, divided government of a dysfunctional sort will be built into our political system for some time to come. While periods of split-party control have led to constructive moments in policy and governance in the past, the new divided government holds no such promise. Electoral outcomes, of course, are not preordained, and Republicans remain within hailing distance of winning the presidency. But the demographic odds are clear. Our current political system is most likely to produce Democratic presidents and Republican Congresses. The increasingly conservative character of the Republican Party makes fierce opposition to a Democratic executive inevitable. The nature of our constitutional structure, particularly the makeup of the Senate, further fosters asymmetric parties by strengthening the forces of conservatism beyond their representation in the population as a whole. The Senate tilts strongly toward rural interests and conservative parts of the country. New York and California have the same representation as do Wyoming and North Dakota. Equal representation for the states gives Republicans a natural advantage. In the 2000 election, George W. Bush carried 30 of the 50 states, even as he lost the popular vote to Al Gore. Translated into Senate votes, a minority share of the ballots would have yielded a filibuster-proof conservative majority based largely in the South and the Rocky Mountain West. The filibuster itself further increases the power of the smaller and mostly more conservative states. In principle, senators representing roughly 11% of the nation's population can produce the 41 votes now required to block action. The importance of rural states in the Senate also means that Democratic majorities are not synonymous with liberal majorities. To win control, Democrats need to secure seats in more conservative states by nominating moderate and moderately conservative candidates. Their losses in 2014 were concentrated in conservative states, most of them in the South. This complicates the task of legislating even when Democrats outnumber Republicans, as the drawn-out battle over the Affordable Care Act demonstrated. The problem for progressives is especially acute when it comes to passing even broadly popular gun control measures such as background checks. By contrast, Republican senators, representing the most conservative parts of the country, are pushed further to the right because they have more reason to fear primary losses than general election defeats. Comparable pressures are at work in the House, where the vast majority of Republicans...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?